I don't get the feeling he would want you to be him.
No, he never did.
Right?
He enjoyed playing with me. That was one of his favorite things, and it was a big reason.
Wolfgang Van Halen was born into a legacy too loud to ignore. As the son of a guitar god, he was practically raised surrounded by sound. But while the world watched his father change music forever, Wolfgang Van Halen was living a very different story. What was his father, Eddie Van Halen, like when the cameras were not on? And why did he refuse to play a single Van Halen song after his father's death? This is the side of Wolfgang Van Halen no one talks about, and you'd be shocked to learn the truth. Growing up Van Halen. Wolfgang William Van Halen was born into a household that was anything but ordinary. His father was Eddie Van Halen, one of the most influential rock guitarists in history, and his mother was actress Valerie Bertinelli, a beloved star of American television. From the very beginning, Wolfgang's life was defined by fame, music, and the shadow of a legendary last name. But behind the glamour of growing up in a famous family, Wolfgang's early years were filled with quiet observation, patient learning, and an undeniable closeness with his father that would shape everything he would eventually become. Growing up, music wasn't just in the air, it was in his blood. While most kids were still learning their alphabets, Wolfgang was already absorbing the rhythms and tones of hard rock. His father, Eddie, wasn't just a guitar icon. At home, he was also a deeply passionate musician who believed in letting his son discover instruments naturally and curiously, the same way he had. Eddie never forced his son into music, but he made sure the tools were there when inspiration struck. This inspiration came early, and at the age of 9, Wolfgang began drumming. Not with professional lessons or under any kind of pressure, just by playing around and figuring things out. On his 10th birthday, Eddie gave him his first real drum set, and that gesture was far more than a gift. It was a quiet acknowledgement from father to son that music could be theirs to share. Wolfgang later recalled how Eddie would record ideas on a tape recorder, and Wolfgang, barely a preteen, would try to mimic them on drums. Those moments were spontaneous and intimate, between a father and son who were speaking in their shared language of rhythm and sound. While drumming was his entry point, Wolfgang didn't stop there. Over time, he taught himself to play the guitar, bass, and piano. This wasn't out of ambition or the pressure of living up to his father's name. Instead, it was born from sheer love of music. He'd often sit with instruments for hours, experimenting with tones, scales, and melodies. He wasn't trying to be Eddie Van Halen. He was trying to be someone who respected his heritage, but was quietly carving out his own voice in a house filled with echoing riffs and late-night jam sessions. By his early teens, it became clear that Wolfgang had not only inherited his father's musical instincts, he had also developed a remarkable ear for melody and arrangement. And in 2006, at just 15 years old, that raw talent led to a moment that would turn heads across the rock world. Wolfgang joined Van Halen as the band's new bassist, replacing longtime member Michael Anthony. It was a controversial decision in some circles. Fans didn't know what to make of the band bringing in Eddie's teenage son, but those close to the family understood that it wasn't nepotism. It was evolution. Wolfgang had spent years learning every song, watching every rehearsal, and playing along in private. He wasn't just familiar with the music, he was emotionally tethered to it. His appointment to the band wasn't a shortcut, it was the result of quiet dedication and trust between father and son. Touring with Van Halen was more than a professional leap for Wolfgang. As a teenager, he was stepping onto stages in front of thousands, standing beside his father and holding down the low end of songs that had changed the face of rock music. And yet, he did it with humility. Critics were surprised by his maturity, and even skeptical fans quickly admitted that Wolfgang brought a new energy to the band that was tight and refreshingly respectful of Van Halen's legacy. In 2012, Wolfgang's journey with the band hit another milestone with the release of A Different Kind of Truth, the first Van Halen studio album in over 14 years. His bass work on the album was competent, confident, and creative. He wasn't mimicking anyone. Instead, he was building grooves that elevated the music while still letting his father's guitar speak at the center. For Wolfgang, this was never about being in the spotlight. It was always about making music with his dad. But while the crowds roared and the band thundered on stage, behind the scenes, life wasn't always easy. Wolfgang was watching his father's health decline slowly, sometimes publicly. However, Eddie never let illness interrupt his passion for performing, especially not when he was sharing the stage with his son. Wolfgang spoke in later interviews about how much those tours meant to both of them. Eddie wasn't just showing the world he could still play. He was spending precious time with his son in the most meaningful way he knew how. They would fly together, eat together, rehearse, joke, and then walk out under the lights together. Those weren't just shows. They were memories being made in real time, under the pressure of cancer treatments and the looming awareness that time might be running out. In many ways, Wolfgang's entry into Van Halen was never about reviving the band's brand or trying to appeal to a younger audience. It was personal. It was a father bringing his son into the world he had built, and a son stepping into that world not to take it over, but to honor it. And through those years on tour and in the studio, Wolfgang wasn't just playing music. He was documenting his relationship with his dad in the most intimate way they both understood, through sound. But behind the scenes, most fans never realized just how much Wolfgang had to carry his father through some of the darkest years of his life. Eddie's genius and struggles. Because behind the iconic riffs, the screaming solos, and the explosive energy that made him one of the most influential guitarists in rock history, Eddie Van Halen was also a deeply complicated man. He was a man driven by genius, haunted by perfection, and often pulled into the darker corners of his own mind and body. Eddie Van Halen didn't just play the guitar, he reinvented it. His groundbreaking use of the tapping technique, which involves using both hands on the fretboard to create rapid, fluid, and almost otherworldly flurries of notes, changed the way guitar was played forever. It was more than innovation. Before Eddie, guitar solos were technical showcases. However, after Eddie, they became sonic roller coasters. What made his style so electrifying was that it wasn't about showing off. Eddie just wanted to explore. He once said he viewed the guitar like a tool with no manual, and every day he was discovering new ways to use it. Whether it was a homemade guitar he called the Frankenstrat, built from spare parts and duct tape, or the way he used volume knobs and harmonics to bend sound into something new, Eddie was always experimenting, pushing boundaries, and chasing something no one else could hear. One of the most iconic moments in his career came in 1982, when he was invited to play the guitar solo on Michael Jackson's Beat It. Eddie walked into the studio, listened to the song a few times, and then laid down a solo that would go on to define an entire era of pop and rock fusion. That solo wasn't about money or fame, because he already had both. It was about creating something unforgettable, and that was always Eddie's driving force. But the same fire that fueled his genius also fed his struggles. For much of his life, Eddie wrestled with addiction. Alcohol and illicit substances became constant companions, sometimes numbing, fueling, and often controlling the rhythm of his days and nights. His addiction wasn't public in a tabloid way, but it had some real impact on him. It lived behind closed doors, in studio sessions that went too long, or mornings that started too late. His bandmates noticed, and his family members were worried. But through it all, Eddie kept playing. In interviews over the years, Eddie spoke candidly, sometimes painfully, about how addiction had shaped him. He admitted that in the peak years of Van Halen's fame, he was often drunk on stage. Not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't stop. The pressure of living up to the legend he had created was immense. He was constantly expected to deliver brilliance, night after night, tour after tour, and perfectionism became a prison. Eddie wasn't just hard on himself, he was hard on others too. Van Halen as a band was notorious for its internal tensions. The revolving door of lead singers, the arguments about direction, and the behind-the-scenes drama often spilled into the public eye. But at the center of it all was Eddie, driven, focused, and often uncompromising. He demanded the best, not because he was arrogant, but because he believed the music deserved nothing less. But that perfectionism often clashed with the egos and personalities around him, leading to friction that would define much of the band's history. At home, those same struggles played out differently. As a father, Eddie was softer and more vulnerable. Wolfgang later shared how, even during the worst periods of addiction, his father never stopped being present for him. They would play together, eat together, and laugh together. But even Wolfgang admitted it wasn't always easy. There were times when his dad was deeply struggling and times when the music took a back seat to the fog of addiction or the exhaustion of treatment. In the early 2000s, Eddie was diagnosed with tongue cancer. He underwent surgery to remove a portion of his tongue, and for a while it seemed like the worst had passed. But health complications kept returning. His hip deteriorated, requiring surgery, and his energy declined. But still, he kept pushing, recording, and performing. Privately, Eddie was also dealing with severe anxiety about his health. He became reclusive at times, staying out of the public eye, avoiding interviews, and retreating into his studio, a place where he could still control the narrative. However, for those closest to him, the signs were clear. Eddie was in pain, and not just physical pain, emotional pain too. The kind that builds up over decades of pressure, mistakes, triumphs, and regret. Even in his final years, Eddie was recording constantly. He filled hard drives with unreleased music, ideas, riffs, and entire songs, waiting for the right moment to share them. Some say he knew he didn't have much time left, and he was racing against the clock to leave behind something meaningful. Not just for the fans, but for his son, Wolfgang. Because at the heart of all this genius, all this struggle, was the bond between a father and his son. Wolfgang wasn't just a bandmate, he was Eddie's anchor, his reason to stay sober, his reason to keep going. And in many ways, Eddie saw in Wolfgang a second chance, not just for music, but for redemption. But Eddie's story isn't just about guitars and battles with addiction. It's also a story of love, the women who shaped his heart, the marriage that changed him, and the relationships that echoed through the music he left behind, the love that lingered. For all the noise that surrounded Eddie Van Halen's life, from the concerts to the studio sessions, the public feuds, and the personal battles, there was one constant thread that ran through it quietly but powerfully, and that was love. Eddie's most well-known relationship began in 1981, when he married actress Valerie Bertinelli, a rising star in Hollywood known for her role on the hit sitcom One Day at a Time. Their wedding captured headlines, and for a while they were seen as one of the industry's golden couples. Beneath the surface, their marriage was never a fairy tale. Fame, addiction, and distance took their toll. Still, out of that complicated union came something both of them cherished more than anything else: their son, Wolfgang. Eddie named him after one of his musical heroes, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It wasn't just a casual choice. Eddie held a deep respect for classical music, especially the way Mozart could blend technical brilliance with emotional depth. In naming his son after the legendary composer, Eddie wasn't just honoring the past, he was setting a tone for the future. Music wasn't going to be something Wolfgang stumbled into. It was already woven into his identity from the moment he was born. As Wolfgang grew, the marriage between Eddie and Valerie began to break down. The pressures of Eddie's touring life, combined with his struggles with substance abuse, created emotional distance that couldn't be ignored. They separated in 2001 and officially divorced in 2007. But what's remarkable about their story is not how it ended, but how it endured. Even after the divorce, Eddie and Valerie remained close. Their bond as co-parents never wavered. They worked together to raise Wolfgang in a way that kept him grounded, supported, and loved, even as he stepped into one of the most high-pressure roles imaginable. In interviews, Valerie often spoke of Eddie with a mix of tenderness and pain, acknowledging the ways they had hurt each other but never questioning the depth of what they had shared. That emotional complexity came into full view after Eddie's death in 2020. Valerie posted a tribute that was as raw as it was revealing. She wrote, "Maybe next time we'll get it right." Those words carried a lifetime of meaning, regret, forgiveness, and hope. It was a public acknowledgement that, despite everything, the love had never fully disappeared. It had just changed shape. Eddie found love again later in life. In 2009, he married Janie Lizewski, a publicist and former stuntwoman who brought a different kind of peace to his world. Their relationship was more private and settled. Janie stood by him through some of the toughest years of his health battles. While the chaos of the past never fully disappeared, Janie's presence seemed to offer Eddie a softer and more stable chapter where quiet dinners and slower mornings still mattered. For Wolfgang, witnessing his father's journey through love, heartbreak, and healing had a deep impact. He grew up seeing not just the highs of romantic connection, but also the complications. He saw the arguments, the reconciliations, the struggles to communicate, and the efforts to co-parent. He saw what it meant to try and to keep trying, even when things didn't work out the way you planned. That emotional maturity carried into Wolfgang's own love life. In 2023, he married his longtime partner, Andrea Alsop, a software engineer who had been by his side for years, through the loss of his father, the launch of his solo career, and the long process of stepping out from behind the Van Halen legacy. Their wedding was a private, intimate affair, but one gesture from that day stood out and spoke volumes. Wolfgang left an empty chair in honor of his father, Eddie. This was a powerful and deeply personal reminder that even though Eddie was gone, his presence was still felt. Wolfgang didn't have to say anything. That one empty chair said it all. Love for Wolfgang wasn't just about romance. It was about memory and about honoring what came before without letting it define what comes next. In many ways, he took the lessons from his parents' relationship and used them to build something stronger and more stable. He found a partner who didn't just understand the weight of his past, but who helped him carry it without being crushed by it. And in doing so, Wolfgang created space in his life not only for love, but also for healing. Although Eddie's relationships were complicated, they were also real, full of effort, flaws, forgiveness, and a quiet kind of loyalty that lasted longer than anyone expected. And now, as Wolfgang builds his own family, those lessons live on in the way he treats his wife. But when Eddie Van Halen's battle with cancer finally came to an end, Wolfgang wasn't just left with memories. He was left with silence, responsibility, and a grief so deep it would take him years to find the words. How Eddie's passing impacted Wolfgang. On October 6, 2020, the world lost a guitar legend. But for Wolfgang Van Halen, that day meant something much more personal. It wasn't just the day the music stopped. It was the day he lost his father, his closest collaborator, and his biggest supporter. Eddie Van Halen died at the age of 65 after a long private battle with cancer. Officially, the cause was a stroke, but by then, Eddie had already been through years of surgeries, treatments, and quiet suffering. According to Wolfgang, when the end came, he and his mother, Valerie Bertinelli, were right there by Eddie's side, holding his hand as he slipped away. For Wolfgang, those final moments were not just the end of a chapter, they were a profound turning point. In one moment, he lost the man who had taught him how to tune a guitar, how to be patient in the studio, and how to chase a melody until it made sense. But more than that, he lost the one person who saw him as Eddie Van Halen's son. In the months that followed, Wolfgang struggled to find solid ground. Publicly, he issued a heartfelt statement where he said, "I've had so many dreams lately where Pop and I are just doing normal things, and then I realize it's a dream. Stop whatever I'm doing and hug him for as long as I can until I wake up. He was the best father I could ever ask for. Every moment I've shared with him on and off stage was a gift." But privately, Wolfgang was wrecked. The grief was overwhelming, suffocating, and unfamiliar in its depth. He described it later as something that sat in the middle of his life and refused to leave. No matter what he did, it was always there, quietly swallowing joy and robbing him of the instinct to celebrate even his own achievements. Eddie had been cremated and his ashes were given to Wolfgang. It was a deeply symbolic gesture that showed that Eddie hadn't just passed down a legacy of music, he had entrusted his son with his memory. Wolfgang chose to scatter his father's ashes off the coast of Malibu, near the water where Eddie had spent so many peaceful moments over the years. But grief didn't end with that moment. If anything, it deepened. And as the music world speculated about a Van Halen tribute concert or a possible reunion with guest performers, Wolfgang made a choice that surprised everyone. He refused to cover any Van Halen songs live. Speaking about his decision in an interview, he said, "Songwriting is a very therapeutic thing for me. I can get through things that I can't through talking or otherwise. That's a big reason why I don't ever want to play Van Halen songs. Because I only want to play with my father, and he's not here to play it." To Wolfgang, playing his father's songs without his father didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like pretending the loss hadn't happened, and so the only way forward was to make something of his own. That decision led to the birth of Mammoth WVH, Wolfgang's solo project, named after the band Eddie had originally played in before Van Halen was formed. But this wasn't just a name from the past. It was a full-circle moment. When speaking about the choice of his band's name in an interview, Wolfgang said, "Growing up, I told my dad that when I had my own band, I'm calling it Mammoth. And here we are. Their first single, Distance, hit with emotional force. Released just a month after Eddie's death, the song was never meant to be part of an album. It was written during those final months of his father's life as a musical letter to the man he was slowly losing. The lyrics were raw and aching, but what truly elevated the song was its music video. It was a montage of home footage showing Eddie and Wolfgang over the years. Not backstage footage, not behind the scenes at concerts, but small, intimate moments of father and son having the best time of their lives. For fans, it was a rare look at Eddie Van Halen not as a rock icon, but as a dad. And for Wolfgang, it was the only tribute that felt real. The song resonated instantly and it went viral. Distance earned Wolfgang his first Grammy nomination, a moment of recognition that under different circumstances might have been a celebration. But even then, Wolfgang said it felt strange and surreal, like it was happening in another life. Still, he kept going. His self-titled debut album, Mammoth WVH, was released in 2021, and it quickly earned respect across the music world. This wasn't tight, thoughtful rock, full of melodic hooks, polished instrumentation, and lyrics that carried real emotional weight. Reviewers praised Wolfgang's songwriting as honest and surprisingly mature. There were no attempts to ride his father's coattails. Instead, he delivered solid songs and played with skill and heart. Even as he promoted the album, Wolfgang made it clear that his father's influence would always be present as a compass. He spoke about how Eddie had always encouraged him to follow his own path, to not worry about living up to the Van Halen name. And that permission gave Wolfgang the courage to say no to expectations and yes to authenticity. And that decision has continued to define him. With every performance, every interview, and every refusal to turn Mammoth into a tribute act, Wolfgang has shown that grief doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes, honoring someone means not copying them, but building something entirely new and letting their spirit live in the silence between the notes. Now, years after Eddie's passing, Wolfgang is still grieving. But just when fans thought they had seen the final goodbye, Wolfgang opened up about his father, Eddie. And it's something no one expected. The tribute no one saw coming. For years, fans wondered what kind of grand tribute Wolfgang Van Halen would create to honor his father. A star-studded concert, a Van Halen reunion, or a cover album. But the truth is, the real tribute was already happening in a way that no one expected. In interviews, Wolfgang made it clear, "I think just doing what I do is enough of a reference and tribute. Just me existing and continuing to be my own person and my own musical space. I don't think people realize that me just doing that is enough of a tribute and respect towards the life that he gave me and the interests he instilled in me." At first, some people didn't understand what he meant, but those who were really listening knew exactly what he was saying. He didn't need to mimic his father's music or live in his shadow to honor him. Every time he stepped on stage with his band, and every time he wrote a song that came from his own life, he was paying tribute in the most honest way possible. This approach confused some fans and even frustrated a few critics, especially when he refused to play Van Halen songs live. But for Wolfgang, it was never about distancing himself from the past. It was about protecting what it meant. He knew that without his father, the music of Van Halen couldn't be the same, and trying to recreate it without Eddie would only feel empty. Wolfgang also found himself clarifying statements that had been twisted online. At one point, a joke he made about Eddie ruining the 80s with his influence on guitar playing went viral, completely out of context. What he had meant as a playful observation about how many imitators flooded the scene after Eddie changed the game was turned into something harsh and misleading. Wolfgang quickly corrected the narrative, reminding people that no one revered Eddie Van Halen more than he did. It was just another example of the emotional tightrope he walks every day when he tries to honor his father while trying to have a voice of his own. The burden of carrying the Van Halen name has definitely taken its toll on Wolfgang. He has spoken openly about the pressure, the grief, and the relentless comparisons. But he's also shown that he's strong enough to keep going, not by being the next Eddie, but by being the first Wolfgang. Through it all, he's leaned on family. In particular, he remains close to his uncle Alex Van Halen, Eddie's brother, and Van Halen's drummer. Alex, who has remained largely out of the public eye since Eddie's passing, has been a quiet pillar of strength for Wolfgang, offering guidance, support, and a connection to the part of the family that still lives in the music. What's your favorite memory of Eddie Van Halen? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.